If you're fascinated by the mysteries between life and death, hit that subscribe button and join our community right now. Every week, we explore extraordinary stories that challenge our understanding of existence. And today's account might just change the way you think about what happens when our hearts stop beating. My name is Elaine Moretti, and until 18 months ago, I was just another cardiac nurse with a skeptical mind and both feet firmly planted in medical science. For almost 2 decades, I'd worked in the cardiology department at St. Vincent Memorial Hospital in Portland, Oregon. I'd seen hundreds of patients flatline. I'd performed countless resuscitations. I'd watched people die and sometimes miraculously come back, when patients occasionally shared strange experiences they'd had while under. I would nod sympathetically, while mentally cataloguing their stories as hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation or medication side effects. That all changed on April 16th, 2023, when I became the patient. It wasn't supposed to be my shift that Sunday. I'd already worked a full week, including a double on Friday, but the pandemic's after effects were still plaguing our hospital. We remained critically understaffed, with nurses quitting in droves after 3 years of unsustainable pressure. When Jessica, our charge nurse, called me at 5 a.m. sounding desperate, I couldn't say no. Too many of my colleagues had already abandoned ship. "I wouldn't ask if we weren't drowning, Elaine," she'd pleaded. "We've got 3 cardiac cases coming up from the ER and Robert's just called in sick." I glanced at my sleeping 15-year-old daughter, Mia, who had crawled into my bed sometime during the night. Since losing her father to cancer 8 months ago, she'd been struggling with insomnia and separation anxiety. I hated leaving her, but I had reliable neighbors who would check in. "Give me 40 minutes, I told Jessica, already calculating how long I could sleep before I absolutely had to get up. The hospital was in chaos when I arrived. The waiting room overflowed with patients. Hallway beds lined the corridors like some makeshift war hospital. Our cardiac ward, normally a model of efficiency, resembled a beehive that had been knocked from its branch. Alarms blared continuously. The unit secretary juggled 3 phone calls simultaneously. 2 residents argued over a treatment plan, while a family member wept quietly in the corner. "Thank God," Jessica said when she spotted me. Her scrubs were stained, her hair escaping its ponytail. She hadn't slept. That much was obvious. "We've got a critical in 4-12. 52-year-old male, massive MI waiting on the cath lab, BP's tanking. Can you take him?" I nodded, stashed my bag and headed straight to room 412 without even stopping for coffee. The irony of the room number didn't strike me until much later. 412 was Mia's birthday, April 12th. For the next 8 hours, I operated on autopilot. I administered medications, monitored vitals, prepped patients for procedures, documented everything, and somehow managed to eat half a protein bar between crises. By hour 9, I was running on fumes, but the department was finally stabilizing. I checked my phone, 3 texts from Mia asking when I'd be home. I promised myself I'd leave after one final round of checks. My patient in 412, Robert Keller, had returned from the cath lab with 2 new stents, but remained critical. His wife sat beside him, clutching his hand, her face a mask of worry etched into deep lines. I smiled reassuringly as I checked his monitors, adjusted his medications, and recorded his vitals. "His numbers are improving," I told her, though in truth, they weren't as strong as I'd hoped. "The cardiologist should be by soon." I was reaching over to adjust his oxygen when it happened, a sudden pressure like an elephant sitting on my chest. Pain radiated down my left arm. The room tilted sideways. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the bed rail. "Are you okay?" Mrs. Keller asked, her worried eyes now fixed on me. I wasn't. I knew exactly what was happening. I'd described these same symptoms to patients 1,000 times, but still, my mind refused to accept it. I was too young, too healthy, too essential to the patients who needed me. "I need to sit down for a second," I managed to say, but my legs were already giving way. I heard Mrs. Keller scream for help as the floor rushed up to meet me. The last thing I remember was the cold tile against my cheek and the thought that Mia would be waiting for dinner that I wouldn't be able to make. Then darkness. But not for long. The darkness dissolved into something else entirely. The pain vanished, the weight lifted, and I found myself looking down at a scene that made no logical sense whatsoever. I was watching myself, my body, sprawled on the floor of room 412, while my colleagues rushed in with the crash cart. "Elaine! Elaine! Can you hear me?" Dr. Patel, our attending cardiologist, was kneeling beside my body, checking for a pulse. His normally calm demeanor had given way to urgent professionalism. "No pulse, starting compressions. Get the defibrillator ready." I felt oddly calm, watching this unfold, detached in a way that should have been disturbing but wasn't. I observed everything with perfect clarity, Jessica calling a code blue, the respiratory therapist placing an oxygen mask over my face, a nurse I didn't recognize cutting open my scrub top to attach the defibrillator pads. I could even see Robert Keller's wife being ushered from the room, her hands pressed against her mouth in horror. "What's happening?" a new resident asked, rushing in. 43-year-old female, apparent cardiac arrest. Dr. Patel responded without pausing compressions. "Likely MI. No prior cardiac history." I wanted to correct him. I'd had a minor arrhythmia diagnosed in my 20s, but of course I couldn't speak. I wasn't there, not physically. Yet I was acutely aware, more aware than I'd ever been in my life. I could see the dust on top of the cabinet near the ceiling, a spot the cleaning staff always missed. I could read the label on a medication vial from across the room. I noticed the time on the wall clock, 3:47 p.m., and realized with strange detachment that my heart had stopped beating. I remember thinking how bizarre it was to be completely calm while witnessing my own death. As a nurse, I'd always assumed that death would be terrifying, the ultimate fear that we all carry. Yet there I was, watching my colleagues fight to restart my heart, and all I felt was a profound sense of peace and curiosity. "Charging to 200, called out Sarah, a nurse I'd mentored since she'd joined our unit 3 years ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared the defibrillator. "Clear!" My body jerked on the floor as the current passed through it. I felt nothing. Dr. Patel immediately checked for a pulse, then shook his head and resumed compressions. "Push 1 of epinephrine," he ordered, "and let's get her on a backboard. We need better leverage for compressions." I found I could move, or rather my consciousness could shift position. I floated closer to watch as they worked on me. What struck me most was the determined focus on everyone's faces. These were my friends, my work family. Yet their expressions were now the same professional masks I'd worn myself hundreds of times while working on strangers. It was oddly touching to see them fighting so hard for me. I noticed Dr. Patel had a coffee stain on his collar that he'd tried to hide under his white coat. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, though her hands now moved with practiced precision. The new resident, whose name I couldn't recall, had a small tattoo visible on his wrist when his sleeve pulled back, a caduceus, the medical symbol. These small details seemed amplified, significant somehow. "Still no pulse," Dr. Patel announced. "Charging to 300, clear." Again my body convulsed, and again nothing changed. I was still there, floating near the ceiling, watching. "Come on, Elaine," Jessica muttered, squeezing a bag of fluids that was now connected to an IV someone had started in my arm. "Don't do this to us. Don't do this to Mia." At the mention of my daughter's name, I felt a pang of, not exactly pain, but a pulling sensation. A tether of connection to something beyond this room. It was the first disruption to the strange peace I'd been experiencing. 4 minutes since collapse," someone called out. "No shockable rhythm." I knew what that meant. After 4 minutes without oxygen, brain damage begins. My chances were diminishing with each passing second. Yet rather than feeling more anxious, I became aware of something new. A soft, almost imperceptible brightness at the periphery of my vision. As my attention shifted toward this light, I felt myself being gently pulled away from the scene below. The hospital room began to recede, growing smaller, as if I were moving backwards through a tunnel. I wasn't scared, quite the opposite. The light emanated warmth and welcome. It felt familiar, like returning home after a long journey. The tunnel stretched and elongated, with the light growing brighter at its end. The hospital scene shrank to a distant pinpoint, and then vanished altogether. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. I couldn't tell if I'd been in this tunnel for seconds or hours. Physical sensations transformed. I no longer felt like I had a body, yet I was more present, more aware than I'd ever been in my physical form. Colors intensified around me, not just ordinary colors, but hues I'd never seen before, colors that don't exist in our physical world. Sounds emerged too, a harmonic resonance that wasn't quite music, but conveyed emotions more precisely than any symphony. It was as if all my senses had melded into one comprehensive form of perception. Then suddenly, the tunnel opened up, and I was elsewhere. The space defied description in conventional terms. It wasn't a place so much as a state of being. The light was everywhere, not blinding but nurturing, and within it, shapes began to form. At first, they were just impressions, like shadows cast by sunlight through leaves, but gradually they solidified into recognizable forms. And that's when I saw him, my grandfather, Pietro. He stood before me, smiling the gentle smile I remembered from childhood, but this wasn't the stooped, arthritic man who had died 12 years earlier. This was my grandfather in his prime, tall, robust, his dark hair untouched by grey, his eyes clear and bright. He wore the same blue button-down shirt he had favoured in life, with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms developed through decades of carpentry work. "Elaine," he said, though his lips didn't move. Somehow I heard him directly in my consciousness. "Mia nipote," my granddaughter. "Nonno," I responded, equally without speaking. "How is this possible? You died, and I'm—" "Not yet," he replied, his expression warm but serious. "You're in between, little one." "Marie!" Before I could ask what he meant, another figure materialized beside him. It took me a moment to recognize her. Margaret Winters, an elderly patient who had died under my care 3 years earlier. She had been a favorite of mine, a former schoolteacher with a sharp wit who had faced her terminal diagnosis with remarkable grace. Like my grandfather, she appeared rejuvenated, vibrant in a way she never had during her final hospital stay. "Ms. Winters," I asked, astonished. "You remember?" she said, seeming pleased. "You sat with me at the end. You held my hand when my family couldn't arrive in time." I had done that. It was against protocol to become personally involved with patients, but I couldn't bear the thought of her dying alone. I'd stayed 2 hours past my shift, telling her stories about my day, about Mia, about anything I could think of to keep her company until she peacefully slipped away. "You weren't supposed to do that," I said. "It was unprofessional." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "It was human, and it mattered more than you know." As we communicated, I became aware of other presences gathering around us, some familiar, others strange, but not frightening. And behind them all, a more substantial presence, radiant and endless, like an ocean of light. I didn't have words for what or who this was, but I felt embraced by unconditional love and understanding so profound that tears would have flowed if I'd had eyes to cry with. "There are things you need to see," my grandfather said, gesturing to the space around us, which began to transform again. Suddenly, I was watching scenes from my life unfold like a movie, but I was both observer and participant, re-experiencing each moment with new perspective. I saw myself as a child, skinning my knee and crying as my mother bandaged it. the tenderness in her touch that I'd forgotten. I saw myself as a teenager, angry and rebellious, hurting those who loved me most. I felt their pain and their unwavering love despite my behavior. I saw my wedding day, the birth of Mia, the crushing grief when my husband was diagnosed with terminal cancer. But most prominently, I saw my life as a nurse. Every patient I'd cared for, every family I'd comforted, every life that had touched mine. Some moments stood out with startling clarity. The time I'd stayed late to help an elderly man write a letter to his estranged son. The young mother whose hand I'd held through a terrifying diagnosis. The countless small kindnesses that seemed insignificant at the time, but now revealed themselves as vital threads in the tapestry of interconnected lives. "Do you see?" Ms. Winters asked gently. "Do you understand now what your life has meant?" I did see. Every action, every choice, every moment of compassion or impatience, generosity or selfishness, all of it mattered in ways I could never have comprehended in life. Nothing was wasted, nothing was without consequence. The ripples of our smallest actions extended outward, touching lives we might never know we'd influenced. "But there's more," my grandfather said. "Watch." The scenes shifted, showing events I hadn't witnessed. Mia growing up without me, graduating from high school, heading to college with a hollow space in her heart where parental love should have been. I saw my colleagues mourning me, then gradually moving on. I saw the patients I would never care for, the lives I would never touch. "It's not your time," a new voice said. Not my grandfather's, not Ms. Winters, but the collective voice of the luminous presence surrounding us all. "You have more to give, more to learn." If you've made it this far into my story, I know you must be wondering, what happens next? Does consciousness really continue after our hearts stop beating? Stay with me until the end, because what I experienced next challenged everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. "What about my choice?" I asked, suddenly understanding that I was at a crossroads. "Do I have one?" "You always have a choice," my grandfather replied. "That is the greatest gift." And it was a difficult choice. The peace I felt in that realm was unlike anything I'd experienced on Earth. The absence of physical pain, emotional suffering, and the burdens of daily life was profoundly liberating. Part of me wanted desperately to stay, to remain in this place of perfect understanding and boundless love. "If I stay," I asked, "what happens?" My grandfather's expression grew solemn. "You would continue your journey with us. Your physical body would release your spirit completely. And if I go back, you return to pain, to struggle," Ms. Winters said gently, "but also to love, to growth, to the beautiful, unfinished symphony of your life." As I contemplated this decision, the scenes of Mia's future without me replayed. I saw her alone in our house on her 16th birthday, trying to celebrate while missing both parents. I witnessed her walking down the aisle someday with an empty space where I should have stood. I felt her unspoken questions about death that would never be answered because I wouldn't be there to share what I now knew. "I have to go back," I said, the decision crystallizing with surprising clarity. "Mia needs me." My grandfather smiled, a mixture of pride and sadness in his eyes. "She does. But remember what you've learned here, Nipotina. Remember what matters." "Will I remember any of this?" I asked, suddenly fearful that this profound experience would vanish like a dream upon waking. "Some forget," Ms. Winters acknowledged. "Others remember pieces. What you carry back depends on your willingness to see." Before I could ask more questions, I sensed a shift in the energy around us. The luminous presence seemed to pulse, and I felt myself being gently pulled backward. "It's time," my grandfather said, reaching out as if to touch my face one last time. "We'll be here when you return, but not yet, not for many years." "Tell Robert Keller it wasn't his fault," Ms. Winters added urgently as the light began to recede. "The fishing trip. Tell him his father forgives him. I wanted to ask what she meant. How could I possibly know anything about Robert Keller's father? But the pulling sensation grew stronger. The figures before me began to fade, the brilliant colors dimmed, and I felt myself rushing backward through the tunnel faster than before. The peace gave way to awareness of sensation, uncomfortable, painful sensation. First came pressure on my chest, rhythmic and forceful. Then sharp, stabbing pain as electricity coursed through my body. Voices filtered in, distorted at first, then clearer. "We've got a rhythm. I've got a pulse. BP's coming up. 90-60. Pupils reactive. Elaine, can you hear me?" The return to my body was excruciating. Every nerve ending screamed in protest. My chest felt like it had been crushed by a wrecking ball. My throat burned from the intubation tube I now realized was helping me breathe. The peaceful weightlessness was replaced by leaden heaviness. My body felt like a prison after the freedom I'd experienced. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Patel's face hovered above me, relief washing over his features as our eyes met. "She's back," he announced to the room. "Elaine, don't try to talk. You're intubated. You had a cardiac arrest, but you're stable now. We're taking you to the ICU." I couldn't speak, but in that moment, I didn't need to. My mind was racing with everything I'd seen, everything I now understood. I felt tears streaming down my face, not from pain, but from the overwhelming reality of what I'd experienced. As they prepared to transfer me to the ICU, my eyes fell on Robert Keller, still in his bed across the room. Despite my condition, a thought surfaced with surprising clarity. I gestured weakly, trying to get Dr. Patel's attention, pointing toward Robert. "Don't worry about your patient," he misunderstood. "Mr. Keller is stable. We're taking care of him." I shook my head, frustrated by my inability to communicate. With effort, I raised my hand and mimicked writing. Someone placed a small whiteboard in my hands, the kind we use for intubated patients who need to communicate. With trembling fingers, I wrote, "Check his right coronary stent. It's clotting." Dr. Patel's brow furrowed as he read my note. "How could you possibly know that? He just came from the cath lab." I had no logical explanation. I just knew with absolute certainty that Robert Keller's stent was failing. Perhaps I'd seen it during my out-of-body experience, or perhaps the knowledge had been given to me on the other side. Either way, I was certain. I underlined the message emphatically and pointed to Robert's monitors, which showed no obvious signs of distress. Dr. Patel hesitated, then called for a portable EKG machine. 5 minutes later, his expression confirmed what I already knew. Subtle ST elevations were beginning to appear, indicating the start of another cardiac event. "Get him back to the cath lab stat," Dr. Patel ordered, then turned to me with disbelief. "You just saved his life. But how did you know?" I couldn't answer then. In fact, it would be days before I could speak, weeks before I could fully explain what had happened to me during those 4 minutes and 37 seconds when my heart had stopped beating. I spent 5 days in the ICU. Tests revealed I had suffered from undiagnosed viral myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle typically caused by a viral infection. It had been silently damaging my heart for weeks while I attributed my fatigue to grief and overwork. The physical recovery was arduous. The emotional and spiritual processing of what I'd experienced was even more challenging. When I was finally able to speak after extubation, the first person I asked to see after Mia was Robert Keller. He was recovering well. The second cath lab visit had indeed revealed a clotting stent that would have caused a massive, potentially fatal heart attack if left untreated. When I entered his room in a wheelchair, a week after my own cardiac arrest, his wife immediately burst into tears and embraced me. "They told us what happened," she said. "You saved Robert's life even while you were fighting for your own." When we had a moment alone, I took a deep breath and delivered the message I'd been entrusted with. "Mr. Keller," I said, my voice still hoarse from the intubation. "This is going to sound strange, but I have a message for you. It's about a fishing trip. And your father, he wants you to know he forgives you." Robert's face drained of color. "How could you possibly know about that?" he whispered. "I've never told anyone, not even my wife." He revealed that when he was 17, he had convinced his father to take their boat out despite storm warnings. The boat had capsized. His father had drowned while ensuring Robert made it to safety. For 35 years, he had carried the guilt of that day, believing his recklessness had cost his father's life. "I can't explain how I know," I told him truthfully. "I can only tell you what I was told to share. He forgives you, and I think it's time you forgave yourself." This moment transformed us both. For Robert, it began a healing process that decades of therapy hadn't accomplished. For me, it was the first confirmation that what I'd experienced was real, not a hallucination, not a dream, not a chemical reaction in my oxygen-deprived brain. Before you decide what to believe about my story, I want to ask you a favor. Tap that like button if something about this resonates with you, and leave a comment about any experiences you've had that science can't fully explain. Your story matters too, and I'd love to hear it. During my recovery at home, I began researching near-death experiences, or NDEs as they're commonly called. I discovered I was far from alone. Thousands of people across cultures, religions, and time periods have reported similar experiences: the tunnel, the light, meetings with deceased loved ones, life reviews, and a profound sense of peace and unconditional love. Many, like me, returned with information they couldn't possibly have known through conventional means. What struck me most was how consistent these accounts were, regardless of the person's religious beliefs or lack thereof. Atheists, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, people from all backgrounds described remarkably similar experiences, though they often interpreted them through their own cultural or spiritual frameworks afterward. Of course, there were the skeptics too. Neurologists suggested oxygen deprivation could trigger hallucinations. Psychologists proposed the experiences were the brain's way of coping with trauma. Pharmacologists pointed to the release of endorphins and other chemicals during cardiac arrest. As a medical professional, I understood these explanations. I might even have believed them once, but they couldn't account for everything I'd experienced. They couldn't explain how I knew about Robert Keller's fishing trip, or how I'd seen the dust on top of the cabinet from a vantage point my physical body had never occupied. They couldn't explain the profound and lasting transformation I underwent, a transformation that went far beyond the typical gratitude for a second chance at life. 2 months after my cardiac arrest, I returned to work at St. Vincent Memorial. My colleagues welcomed me back with open arms, though I noticed subtle changes in how some of them interacted with me. Word had gotten around about my prediction regarding Robert Keller's stent. Some avoided the topic altogether. Others, like Sarah, approached me privately. "I've been wanting to ask you something," she said one quiet night shift, when we were alone at the nurse's station. "What was it like? When your heart stopped, did you see anything?" I hesitated, weighing how much to share. In the medical community, discussing NDEs too openly could damage your professional credibility. But Sarah's expression was earnest, curious without judgment. "I experienced something," I acknowledged carefully, "something that changed everything I thought I knew about death." "My brother had an experience," she confided. "After his motorcycle accident. He never talks about it because he thinks people will think he's crazy, but it changed him completely." This conversation opened a floodgate. Over the following weeks, more colleagues approached me with similar stories, their own experiences or those of patients who had confided in them. I realized that beneath the scientific veneer of our hospital, many healthcare workers harbored questions about what happens at the boundary between life and death. 3 months after my return to work, I organized an informal support group for healthcare professionals interested in discussing NDEs. We met monthly, creating a safe space to share experiences and research without fear of ridicule. What began as 6 nervous people in the hospital conference room, after hours, grew to over 30 participants, including doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, and even our hospital chaplain. My physical recovery progressed well, but the psychological impact was more complex. I found myself increasingly sensitive to my patients' emotional states, often sensing their distress before they vocalized it. Several times I experienced strong intuitions about their conditions that later proved accurate. My colleagues noticed the change. "It's like you've developed a 6th sense," Jessica commented after I'd correctly suggested a patient needed to be checked for pulmonary embolism despite minimal symptoms. "You're different since you came back." I was different, fundamentally so. My priorities had shifted. The career advancement I'd once pursued relentlessly no longer seemed important. Instead, I found myself spending more time with patients, really listening to their fears and concerns. I started volunteering at a grief support group for teenagers, helping kids like Mia process their losses. Work-life balance, which had always been a struggle, became non-negotiable. I never missed Mia's school events anymore. No emergency seemed dire enough to sacrifice time with my daughter. The most profound change was my relationship with death itself. The paralyzing fear most people feel, the fear I'd felt myself before my experience, was gone. Not that I wanted to die. Quite the opposite. I treasured life more deeply than ever, but I no longer dreaded the inevitable transition that awaited at the end. This new perspective created a strange dichotomy in my professional life. On one hand, I was more empathetic, more present, more intuitive with my patients. On the other, I sometimes found it difficult to match my colleagues' frantic energy when trying to resuscitate patients with minimal chances of recovery or poor quality of life prospects. "Sometimes letting go is an act of compassion," I said during an ethics committee meeting 6 months after my return. We were discussing whether to continue aggressive interventions for a 93-year-old patient with multi-system organ failure. "Death isn't always the worst outcome." The statement raised eyebrows. In a medical culture devoted to extending life at almost any cost, such sentiments bordered on heresy. Yet privately, several senior doctors confessed they agreed but couldn't say so publicly. My experience changed how I approached end-of-life conversations with families. Where once I'd carefully avoided any language that might suggest continuity of consciousness after death, I now found gentle ways to offer comfort that aligned with both medical ethics and my newfound understanding. "Your mother is transitioning," I told a tearful daughter, maintaining vigil by her unconscious parent. "Whatever comes next, I believe she'll be at peace." It wasn't strictly medical language, but the relief on the woman's face told me it was exactly what she needed to hear. If this story has given you even a moment of peace or reflection about death and what might come after, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these profound human experiences that often go undiscussed in our society. About a year after my NDE, I received a letter from a doctor in Seattle who had heard about my experience through a mutual colleague. Dr. Elizabeth Chen was a neurologist who had been studying NDEs for over a decade, collecting accounts and correlating them with medical data. She asked if I would be willing to participate in her research. After careful consideration, I agreed. My experience had been well documented medically. My cardiac arrest had occurred in a hospital with continuous monitoring. The exact duration of my clinical death was recorded. My unexplainable knowledge of Robert Keller's condition and personal history were witnessed and confirmed. I represented what researchers called a gold standard case, one with both objective medical documentation and verified paranormal knowledge. I flew to Seattle for 3 days of interviews, psychological evaluations, and brain scans. Dr. Chen's approach was refreshingly balanced, neither dismissing the spiritual implications of NDEs nor abandoning scientific rigor. Most researchers approach this topic with their minds already made up, she told me as we reviewed my EEG results. Either they're determined to prove NDEs are just brain activity, or they're so convinced of the spiritual reality that they ignore physiological factors. The truth is likely more complex than either extreme. Her research had identified patterns in brain activity among NDE survivors that differed from typical patients who'd experienced cardiac arrest without an NDE. She was particularly interested in changes to the temporal lobe and certain brainwave patterns that persisted long after the event. "Your scans show some of these same patterns," she explained, pointing to colorful images of my brain. "But we still don't know if these changes cause the experience or result from it." In Dr. Chen's office, I met other NDE survivors, a construction worker who had been electrocuted, a college student who had drowned and been resuscitated, a pilot who had clinically died during surgery. Despite our different backgrounds and circumstances, the core elements of our experiences were strikingly similar. We all spoke of the tunnel, the light, the profound peace. We all returned with a similar message: love matters more than anything else. "Whatever causes these experiences," Dr. Chen said during our final meeting, "the consistent therapeutic effect is undeniable. People who have NDEs show reduced fear of death, increased empathy, and greater life satisfaction afterward, even if we eventually identify a purely neurological explanation. The positive transformation is real." I returned from Seattle with a renewed determination to share my experience more broadly. With Dr. Chen's encouragement, I began speaking at nursing conferences about NDEs and their implications for patient care. I emphasized the importance of taking patients' accounts seriously, regardless of one's personal beliefs about what causes them. When a patient tells you they left their body or met deceased relatives during cardiac arrest, dismissing their experience as just a hallucination can be deeply harmful, I told a room of critical care nurses in Denver. These experiences are profoundly meaningful to patients. Honoring their reality is part of holistic care. My presentations weren't always well received. At one medical conference, a prominent neurologist publicly challenged me, calling my account anecdotal evidence at best, dangerous pseudoscience at worst. His dismissal stung, but I had anticipated such reactions. "I respect your skepticism," I responded. "Science advances through questioning. But I would ask you to consider that dismissing thousands of consistent accounts across cultures and history might reflect a different kind of bias, one that automatically privileges certain types of evidence over others." The exchange made headlines in several medical journals. To my surprise, I received emails from dozens of doctors who had either experienced NDEs themselves or had patients whose unexplainable knowledge during clinical death had shaken their materialist worldview. Many had remained silent, fearing professional repercussions if they expressed openness to phenomena that challenged conventional medical understanding. 18 months after my cardiac arrest, I published an article in a respected nursing journal titled "Beyond the Monitors: What Near-Death Experiences Can Teach Healthcare Providers." The piece struck a careful balance between respecting scientific methodology and advocating for more open-minded approaches to patients' subjective experiences. It generated considerable debate, but also opened doors for more research funding in this area. Throughout this journey of recovery, research, and advocacy, Mia remained my anchor. Our relationship had transformed in the wake of my NDE. The typical mother-teenager conflicts that had characterized our interactions before my cardiac arrest seemed trivial now. We spoke more openly, more honestly about everything, including death. "Are you sure it wasn't just your brain doing weird stuff because you were dying?" she asked one evening as we walked our dog through the neighborhood. At 15, she maintained a healthy skepticism that I respected. "I can't prove it wasn't," I admitted. but it felt more real than anything I've ever experienced. And I knew things I couldn't have known. She considered this. It's weird that it happens to so many people the same way. That's one of the things that makes researchers think there might be something to it. So you're not afraid of dying anymore? She asked, her voice small. I put my arm around her shoulders. I'm not afraid of what comes after death, but I'm very much afraid of missing out on your life. That's why I came back. She leaned into me then, and I felt the weight of what I'd almost lost, and what I'd gained through this extraordinary experience. If you've been moved by this account of crossing the boundary between life and death, take a moment to share this video with someone who might find meaning in it. Each person's journey is unique, but these experiences connect us all in our shared humanity. My story continues to unfold. I still work at St. Vincent Memorial, though I've reduced my hours to make time for speaking engagements and my ongoing collaboration with Dr. Chen's research team. The support group I started for healthcare professionals has been replicated in hospitals across 3 states. Last month, I was invited to join the hospital's ethics committee, bringing my perspective to difficult end-of-life decisions. My cardiac health remains stable. The myocarditis resolved with treatment, though I'll always carry a slightly higher risk of future cardiac events. I take my medications faithfully and have adopted a healthier lifestyle, not from fear, but from gratitude for the body that houses my consciousness during this lifetime. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and wakefulness, I feel echoes of the peace I experienced during those 4 minutes and 37 seconds of clinical death. The memory of that realm remains vivid, undimmed by time. In difficult moments, I return to it mentally, drawing strength from the knowledge that we are more than our physical bodies, that love transcends the boundaries of life and death, that nothing that truly matters is ever lost. I don't claim to understand the full nature of what I experienced or what awaits us all eventually. I hold my conclusions lightly, remaining open to new evidence and perspectives. But I know with unshakable certainty that death is not the end, merely a transition to something we can barely comprehend from our limited vantage point in physical reality. As I write this, I'm looking at a photograph on my desk. My grandfather Pietro in his workshop, smiling at the camera with sawdust in his hair. Beside it sits a thank you card from Robert Keller, who has since become an advocate for cardiac health in his community. These reminders ground me in the continuing connections between worlds that once seemed separate, but that I now understand are merely different aspects of one continuous reality. If my account has touched something in you, whether belief, curiosity, or simply a moment of contemplation about life's deeper mysteries, then sharing my experience has been worthwhile. After all, that's the message I brought back from the other side. Connection matters. Love matters. The kindness we show one another ripples outward in ways we may never fully comprehend from this side of existence. And if someday you find yourself traveling through a tunnel of light toward a realm of unconditional love and understanding, remember that you're not alone. Countless others have made this journey before you. I'll be there too, eventually. But not yet. We both have more living to do first. My experience with death continues to shape my daily life in ways both profound and mundane. After returning to work, I began noticing subtle vibrations in the energy around certain patients, particularly those approaching transition. It wasn't something I could see or hear in the conventional sense, but rather a knowing that emerged from somewhere beyond my 5 physical senses. The first time I recognized what was happening, I was caring for Eleanor, an 87-year-old woman recovering from pneumonia. Her vital signs were stable, her lab values improving, and the medical team was discussing discharge plans. But as I adjusted her IV, I felt a distinct shift in the energy around her bed, a lightening, an opening, as if the boundary between worlds was growing thinner. "Eleanor," I said quietly, sitting beside her. "Is there anyone you need to speak with? Anyone you haven't had a chance to say goodbye to?" She studied my face with clear blue eyes that suddenly seemed to look through me rather than at me. "You know, don't you?" she whispered. "You've been where I'm going." I nodded, taking her hand. "Your family thinks you're getting better." "The doctors do too." She smiled faintly. "But we know better, don't we? Is there someone I should call?" "My grandson in Boston," she said. "He's been avoiding visiting because he can't bear to say goodbye, but I think he'll regret it if he doesn't." That evening, when her family had gone home for dinner, Eleanor slipped away peacefully. Her grandson had arrived just an hour before, giving them precious time to exchange words of love and forgiveness. I would like to ask one small favor of you now. Hit that subscribe button so we can continue exploring these profound moments where life and death meet in unexpected ways. This heightened awareness wasn't limited to my patients. 6 months after my NDE, I was grocery shopping when I noticed an elderly man selecting apples with methodical care. The same energetic signature surrounded him. That unmistakable thinning of the veil. I didn't know him, had never spoken to him, yet I knew with absolute certainty that his transition was imminent. For days afterward, I wrestled with this knowledge. What responsibility did it carry? Was I meant to approach strangers and warn them? The idea seemed absurd, potentially harmful, yet ignoring these perceptions felt equally wrong. I brought this dilemma to my support group, where others who'd had NDEs shared similar experiences. One woman, a former emergency room doctor, had developed such accurate intuitions about patient outcomes that she'd left clinical practice, unable to bear the weight of foreknowledge without the ability to change outcomes. "It's not about prevention," suggested Michael, a hospice nurse who'd had an NDE after a motorcycle accident. "Maybe it's about presence, being fully with people during crucial transitions, whether they know what's coming or not." His words resonated. I realized my gift, if that's what it was, wasn't meant to prevent the inevitable, but to bring greater compassion and awareness to these transitions. This understanding was tested when my daughter's beloved high school English teacher, Mr. Ramirez, appeared in my classroom during a guest lecture I was giving on cardiac care. The moment he walked in, I recognized the now familiar energetic signature. He was young, barely 40, vibrant and engaged with his students. There were no obvious signs of illness. Yet I knew. After class, I approached him carefully. "This might sound strange, but have you had a checkup recently?" He seemed surprised but not offended. "Actually, I've been putting it off. Been having some weird symptoms, probably nothing." "Promise me you'll go this week," I said, trying to keep my voice casual while conveying urgency. Better to be sure. 2 weeks later, Mia came home devastated. Mr. Ramirez had been diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was poor. I visited him in the hospital, bringing books and my presence. I didn't mention my foreknowledge, but I think he sensed something. During my third visit, he looked up from his novel and asked directly, "You knew, didn't you, that day in your classroom?" I hesitated, then nodded. "I thought so," he said calmly. "There was something in your eyes." He closed his book. "I'm not afraid, you know, but I'm curious. What was it like for you, on the other side?" I broke my usual rule about sharing details of my NDE and told him everything: the tunnel, the light, my grandfather, the profound peace. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions without skepticism. "Thank you," he said when I finished. "It's like getting a travel guide for a journey I'm about to take." Mr. Ramirez died 3 weeks later. At his memorial service, his husband approached me. "Whatever you told him during your visits brought him incredible peace," he said. "He wasn't afraid at the end. He said he felt like he was just changing classrooms, not leaving school." The metaphor was so perfectly aligned with Mr. Ramirez's passion for teaching that it brought tears to my eyes. If my story has moved you or made you think differently about the boundary between life and death, please consider leaving a comment sharing your own experiences or questions. This community becomes richer when we all contribute our unique perspectives. As my reputation for understanding death transitions grew within the hospital, I began receiving requests to be present for difficult cases, terminal extubations, comfort care conversations, patients without family. My role expanded beyond traditional nursing into something hospital administrators didn't quite know how to categorize but recognized as valuable. Dr. Patel, who had led my resuscitation, became one of my strongest allies. Initially skeptical about NDEs, his position softened after witnessing too many unexplainable phenomena in his long career. "I don't need to understand the mechanism to acknowledge the benefit," he said pragmatically after observing a family conference where my insights had helped resolve a conflict about end-of-life care. "Whatever you're doing, it helps patients and families. That's what matters." With his support, I developed a pilot program at St. Vincent Memorial called Compassionate Transitions. The initiative trained nurses to recognize and respond to the emotional and spiritual needs of dying patients, regardless of religious background. We incorporated elements from hospice care into the acute hospital setting, creating sacred space for life's final transition, even in high-tech environments like the ICU. The program attracted attention beyond our hospital. I began receiving invitations to speak at medical conferences, nursing schools, and hospice organizations. Some invitations I declined, those that seemed more interested in sensationalizing my NDE than in improving patient care. Others I accepted, particularly those focused on integrating spiritual awareness into evidence-based healthcare. 2 years after my cardiac arrest, I published a book titled The Nurse Who Died: What I Learned on the Other Side About Healing on This Side. The publishing process was challenging. I insisted on maintaining the integrity of my experience while making it accessible to both medical professionals and general readers. The book found an unexpected audience, selling well beyond the publisher's modest expectations and being translated into 11 languages. The success brought opportunities, but also challenges. Some colleagues grew distant, uncomfortable with my increasing public profile. Media requests poured in, many seeking sensational angles I refused to provide. Religious groups alternately embraced or condemned me, depending on how well my account aligned with their doctrines. Through it all, I tried to maintain the primary focus on improving care for the dying and bringing comfort to the grieving. Mia, now 17, handled the attention with remarkable poise. "My mum literally came back from the dead to raise me," she told a curious classmate, with typical teenage dramatic flair. "So yes, I do have to do my homework." Her humor helped ground me when the demands became overwhelming. So did my ongoing nursing work. No matter how hectic my schedule became, with speaking engagements and research collaborations, I maintained regular shifts at St. Vincent Memorial. The hands-on care of patients kept me connected to the fundamental purpose that had emerged from my NDE, being present for others during their most vulnerable moments. 3 years after my experience, I received an email that would open yet another unexpected chapter in my journey. The message came from Dr. Samir Gupta, a quantum physicist at MIT, who had read my book while recovering from his own cardiac event. "Your description of consciousness existing separate from the brain aligns with emerging theories in quantum physics," he wrote. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of collaboration." I was skeptical at first. My experience had been deeply personal, not scientific. But our initial video call intrigued me. Dr. Gupta wasn't trying to explain away NDEs through materialist science. Instead, he was exploring how quantum mechanics might provide a framework for understanding consciousness that extended beyond the physical brain. The observer effect in quantum physics suggests consciousness may be more fundamental than matter, he explained. Your experience offers qualitative data that complements our theoretical models. And our collaboration led to a groundbreaking interdisciplinary conference at MIT titled Consciousness at the Boundary, where neuroscience, physics, and human experience meet. The event brought together scientists, healthcare providers, and NDE survivors in unprecedented dialogue. Traditional boundaries between disciplines dissolved as we explored the greatest mystery of human existence from multiple perspectives. Dr. Chen presented her neurological research. Dr. Gupta discussed quantum models of consciousness. I shared my personal experience and its implications for patient care. Each viewpoint illuminated different aspects of the same profound mystery. The conference received significant media attention, much of it centered on the surprising alliance between hard science and subjective experience. MIT physicists consider the afterlife, read one headline, oversimplifying but capturing public imagination. As I approached the 4th anniversary of my cardiac arrest, my life had transformed in ways I could never have anticipated. My understanding of death, and therefore of life, had fundamentally changed. My professional focus had expanded beyond conventional nursing into education, research, and advocacy. My personal relationships had deepened, informed by the knowledge that love transcends physical boundaries. Yet despite these changes, some things remained constant. I still felt the same joy watching Mia perform in her school play as I had before my NDE. I still got frustrated in traffic. I still laughed at silly movies and cried at sentimental commercials. The profound spiritual awareness I'd gained hadn't separated me from ordinary human experience. It had embedded me more deeply in it, allowing me to find the sacred within the mundane. One ordinary Tuesday, as I was charting at the nurse's station after a busy shift, I felt a familiar presence beside me. Looking up, I saw Robert Keller, my former patient whose failing stent I had somehow known about during my NDE. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, extending his hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," I assured him, genuinely pleased to see him looking healthy and vital. "And please, call me Elaine." "Elaine, then." He smiled. "I wanted to let you know I'm moving to Arizona next month. My wife and I are retiring early. Life's too short to postpone joy, as I think we both learned." "That's wonderful news. Before I left, I wanted to give you something." He handed me a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of waves. "I took up woodworking after my recovery. It helps me feel connected to my father." I opened the box to find a beautifully crafted wooden heart inside. "It's symbolic, of course," he said with a slight embarrassment, "but I wanted you to have a tangible reminder of the heart you saved, both physically and spiritually." The gesture moved me deeply. "Thank you, Robert. This means more than you know." As he turned to leave, he paused. "One more thing. I've been meaning to ask you something for years now. How did you know about the fishing trip? About my father's forgiveness?" No one knew that story. I considered how to answer, weighing various explanations. In the end, I chose simple truth. "I met someone while I was gone," I said quietly. "Someone who knew your story and wanted you to know you were forgiven. I was just the messenger." The profound impact of Robert's question lingered with me long after he moved to Arizona. How did I know? It was the question skeptics asked most frequently, the one that scientific explanations struggled to address. Information acquisition during clinical death, especially information later verified to be accurate, represented the most compelling evidence that consciousness might extend beyond the physical brain. I had accumulated a substantial collection of such instances in my work with dying patients. There was Maria, who described conversations her family had in the waiting room while she was unconscious and coding in the ICU. Details she recounted with perfect accuracy. There was James, who during cardiac arrest had visited his sister's house across the country and returned with knowledge of a new painting she had hung that morning, confirmed later by phone. And there were countless patients who, in their final moments, reported seeing deceased relatives waiting for them, relatives they sometimes didn't know had died. Not every healthcare provider was comfortable with these accounts. Many of my colleagues maintained a polite skepticism, attributing such phenomena to coincidence, subconscious awareness, or the brain's attempt to create meaning during trauma. I understood their position. Before my own experience, I likely would have held similar views. We're coming to the final part of this journey together, and I'd be grateful if you would give this video a thumbs up to help it reach others who might find comfort in these experiences of what lies beyond our physical existence. One evening, while working late on research for a follow-up book, I received an unexpected call from Jessica, the charge nurse who had been present during my cardiac arrest. "Elaine, I need your help," she said, her voice tense. "It's my father. He's dying." Jessica's father, Martin, had been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer 3 months earlier. He had declined rapidly despite treatment, and Jessica had recently moved him into her home for hospice care. "He's terrified," she continued. "Not just in pain, but genuinely terrified of dying. Nothing I say comforts him. I thought maybe you could talk to him." I agreed immediately. An hour later, I sat beside Martin's bed in Jessica's guest room, now transformed into a home hospice space. Medical equipment hummed quietly. Family photos covered the walls. Martin himself was gaunt, his skin yellowed from liver involvement, his breathing labored. "Mr. Reynolds," I began gently, taking his hand. "I'm Elaine, Jessica's colleague." "The one who died," he said weakly. "Jessie told me about you." "Yes, I had an experience with death," I confirmed, "and I came back." "But what was it like?" He asked the question directly, his eyes suddenly focused with an intensity that belied his physical condition. "I need to know. I'm so scared." I described my experience in detail: the tunnel, the light, the profound peace, my meeting with loved ones. I told him about the overwhelming sense of being loved and accepted completely. I shared how the fear of death had left me entirely since my return. As I spoke, the tension gradually left Martin's face. His breathing eased slightly. His grip on my hand relaxed. "You're sure?" he asked when I finished. "You're sure it wasn't just your brain playing tricks?" "I can't offer scientific proof," I admitted. "But I can tell you, it felt more real than anything I've experienced in this life. And I'm not alone. Thousands of people across cultures and throughout history have reported similar experiences." "I've been so afraid," he confessed. "I've lived a good life, tried to be a decent man, but still the thought of nothingness, it's terrifying. From what I've seen, both in my own experience and in being with many dying patients, there is no nothingness," I assured him. "There's continuation, transformation, and profound love waiting for you." We talked for nearly 2 hours. Martin shared his life's regrets and proudest moments. He spoke of his late wife, wondering if she would be there to meet him. I listened, offering neither false certainties nor easy platitudes, but sharing honestly what I had experienced and observed. Before I left, Martin asked if I would be present when his time came. "Having someone who understands, who's been there, it would help," he said. I promised I would try. 3 days later, Jessica called to say Martin was actively transitioning. I arrived to find the family gathered around his bed. Martin was unconscious, his breathing irregular. Jessica looked up gratefully when I entered. "He's been calling for Mom," she said. "Do you think she's here for him?" "Yes," I said with quiet certainty. "She's here, and he knows it." I took a position at the foot of the bed, slightly apart from the family circle. From this vantage point, I could observe not just Martin's physical body, but also the energetic changes occurring around him. The boundary between worlds was thinning perceptibly. The room felt charged with a gentle electricity, a sacred presence that transcended religious categories. Martin's breathing changed, the familiar Cheney-Stokes pattern that often precedes death. His family leaned closer, murmuring words of love and permission, and then, in a moment I've witnessed dozens of times, yet still find profound each time, I saw the subtle separation begin, the essence of Martin becoming distinct from his physical form. Most people cannot see this transition, but since my NDE, I've developed a perception that extends beyond ordinary sight. I don't see it with my physical eyes, but with an inner awareness that feels as reliable as any of my five senses. What I perceived was beautiful. Martin's consciousness rose from his body like mist from morning waters. Around him, other presences gathered, indistinct to my limited perception, but clearly there to welcome him. As his last breath left his physical form, his essence moved toward these waiting presences with recognition and joy. Jessica was watching my face. "You can see something, can't you?" she whispered. I nodded. He's not alone, and he's not afraid anymore. Later, after the hospice nurse had come and gone, and the funeral home had taken Martin's body, Jessica and I sat in her kitchen sharing a cup of tea. "Thank you," she said. "You gave my father something I couldn't, even though I'm a nurse too. You gave him everything he needed most," I assured her. "Love, care, presence. My contribution was small." "No," she shook her head firmly. "What you gave him was hope. Concrete hope based on experience, not just comforting words or religious teachings he wasn't sure he believed." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about applying for that research position with Dr. Chen's team. After seeing how you helped my father, I want to be part of understanding these transitions better." This conversation with Jessica crystallized something I'd been considering for months. My individual experience, while profound, was ultimately anecdotal. But the collective weight of thousands of similar accounts throughout human history suggested a pattern worthy of serious scientific inquiry. What if more healthcare providers who'd had NDEs came forward to collaborate with researchers? What if we could create a bridge between subjective experience and objective investigation? The following month, I launched the Healthcare NDE Registry, a secure database where medical professionals who had experienced clinical death could document their experiences, particularly instances of verified information acquisition while dead. The registry's scientific advisory board included neurologists, cardiologists, quantum physicists, and consciousness researchers. Its ethical protocols were rigorous, designed to protect privacy while advancing knowledge. Within 6 months, we had collected accounts from over 200 healthcare providers across 4 continents. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, respiratory therapists, and others who had experienced clinical death and returned. The patterns were remarkable. Despite differences in culture, religion, and medical specialty, the core elements remained consistent. The sense of peace, the tunnel or transition, encounters with deceased loved ones, and a profound transformation in their relationship with death. More compelling still were the 122 documented cases of information acquisition, registry participants who had obtained verifiable information while clinically dead that they could not have known through normal means. These ranged from conversations occurring in waiting rooms, to the location of lost objects, to medical conditions in other patients that proved accurate. The registry attracted attention from mainstream medical journals. While some dismissed our work as pseudoscience, others recognized the potential significance of these collective accounts. The British Medical Journal published an editorial suggesting that, while individual NDE accounts may be dismissed, the consistent patterns across thousands of cases merit serious scientific consideration. 4 years after my cardiac arrest in room 412, I found myself addressing the International Conference on Consciousness Studies in Zurich. The audience included neuroscientists, philosophers, physicists, and physicians from prestigious institutions worldwide. As I shared both my personal experience and the preliminary findings from our registry, I reflected on the journey that had brought me there. The evidence suggests that consciousness may not be merely a product of brain activity, I concluded. Rather, the brain may function more like a transceiver, processing and limiting universal consciousness into the individualized awareness we experience as human beings. When the brain's functions are compromised during clinical death, this filtering mechanism may temporarily lift, allowing expanded awareness of realities normally inaccessible to us. The presentation sparked vigorous debate among attendees. Some dismissed the registry's findings as coincidence and selective reporting. Others saw potential alignment with quantum theories of consciousness. What gratified me most was that the conversation was happening at all, that experiences once relegated to religious contexts or dismissed entirely were being discussed seriously in scientific settings. My life had come full circle. The cardiac nurse who had once gently dismissed patients' afterlife accounts was now at the forefront of researching them. The skeptic had become, if not a believer in the religious sense, then a knower, someone whose direct experience had transformed theoretical questions into lived reality. Mia, now preparing for college, had grown up alongside this transformation. She had watched her mother evolve from a conventional healthcare provider into someone who straddled the worlds of science and spirituality, medicine and mystery. "Are you nervous about my leaving?" she asked one evening as we sorted through college brochures scattered across our kitchen table. "About being alone?" The question carried weight. Since her father's death and my NDE, we had rarely been separated for more than a day or two. "I'll miss you terribly," I admitted, "but I'm not afraid, if that's what you're asking." "Because you know we're always connected?" She said it less as a question than a statement of something she'd absorbed over years of hearing me speak about my experience. "Yes. And because I've learned that separation is never as complete as it seems." I smiled at her. "Besides, you'll only be in Boston. They have phones there, I hear." She laughed, then grew serious again. "Mom, do you think Dad knows about everything that's happened with us, about me going to college?" It was a profound question, one that touched on the nature of consciousness after death, the continuing bonds between the living and the dead, the possibility of awareness across the boundary that separates our worlds. "Yes," I said with the quiet certainty that had become my hallmark. "Not in the same way he would if he were here physically, but yes, I believe he knows, and I believe he's proud of you." She nodded, satisfied with this answer in a way she might not have been before witnessing my journey. Later that night, preparing for bed, I paused before the mirror. The woman looking back at me bore the visible signs of her journey. A few more lines around the eyes, a streak of grey at the temple that hadn't been there before my heart stopped in room 412. But the most significant changes weren't visible on the surface. I had died and returned. I had glimpsed what waits beyond the threshold that all humans eventually cross. I had been transformed by that glimpse in ways both subtle and profound. And I had devoted my second chance at life to illuminating that threshold for others, offering comfort to the dying, hope to the grieving, and perhaps a small contribution to our collective understanding of consciousness itself. As a nurse, I had always believed my purpose was saving lives. Now I understood that sometimes the greatest service we can offer is not fighting death, but illuminating it, helping others navigate the transition with awareness and grace, free from unnecessary fear. The journey that began with a flatline in room 412 continues to unfold in unexpected ways. Each day brings new patients, new stories, new opportunities to bridge the worlds of science and spiritual experience. I don't claim to have all the answers. What I have instead is a lived experience that has opened my eyes to greater possibilities than I once imagined, and the privilege of sharing those possibilities with others when they need them most. Death will come for me again someday, as it comes for us all. When it does, I'll recognize it as an old acquaintance rather than an enemy. And I'll step across that threshold with the confidence of someone returning to a place they've visited before. A place where love awaits, where consciousness continues, where nothing of value is ever truly lost. Until then, I remain here, a witness to both worlds, a translator between them, and a grateful participant in the ongoing mystery of existence itself. For the past 5 years since my experience in room 412, I've received thousands of messages from people around the world. Some share their own NDEs, seeking validation for experiences they've hesitated to discuss with family or healthcare providers. Others write on behalf of dying loved ones, hoping my insights might ease their transition. Medical professionals reach out with questions about integrating spiritual awareness into clinical practice. Skeptics challenge my account, often respectfully, sometimes less so. I try to respond to as many messages as possible, seeing each as an opportunity to extend the compassion and understanding I received on the other side. But one message stood out among all others, an email from a neurosurgeon in Japan who specialized in consciousness research. "I have been studying near-death experiences for 30 years, Dr. Tanaka wrote. Your registry data corresponds remarkably with my clinical observations. But I believe we are still missing a crucial component in our understanding. Would you consider participating in an experimental protocol?" The protocol Dr. Tanaka described was revolutionary. Using advanced brain imaging technology during hospice transitions to map the shifts in consciousness as patients approached death. With appropriate ethical approvals and the full consent of patients and families, his team had documented consistent patterns of brain activity in the final hours of life. Patterns that challenged conventional understanding of how consciousness relates to neural function. In some cases, he explained during our video conference, we observe increased coherence and complexity in brain patterns as physical function deteriorates, the opposite of what materialist models would predict. It's as if consciousness expands rather than diminishes as the body shuts down. His findings aligned with what I had witnessed countless times at the bedside, but had struggled to describe in scientific terms. Dr. Tanaka was offering a bridge between subjective experience and objective measurement, a way to study the transition of consciousness with both compassion and rigor. After consulting with my research colleagues, I accepted Dr. Tanaka's invitation. 3 months later, I arrived in Kyoto for a 2-week collaboration that would eventually evolve into an ongoing partnership. Together, we developed a protocol combining his imaging expertise with my clinical observations of dying patients. The work was demanding but deeply meaningful. With each patient who consented to participate in our study, we documented both measurable brain activity and subjective experiences reported by those who stabilized after approaching death. We observed patterns that suggested consciousness might indeed function independently of brain activity during certain transitional states. Our findings, published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, sparked intense debate in both medical and philosophical communities. We made no claims about proving the existence of an afterlife. Science cannot address such questions definitively. Instead, we focused on documenting phenomena that challenged existing models of consciousness and suggesting new frameworks for understanding the mind-brain relationship. If you've stayed with me throughout this entire journey, I want to personally thank you. Your willingness to explore these profound questions about consciousness and what happens when we die means more than you know. Our collective openness to these experiences helps bring comfort to those facing their final transition. The most unexpected outcome of my collaboration with Dr. Tanaka came during my final week in Japan. After a particularly intense research session, he invited me to visit a local Zen temple where his brother served as a monk. I accepted, curious about how different spiritual traditions approached the questions we were studying scientifically. The temple grounds were serene, with carefully raked gravel gardens and ancient cedar trees. Snow fell softly as we walked the winding path to the meditation hall. Inside, several monks sat in silent meditation. The simplicity and stillness of the space reminded me, strangely enough, of what I had experienced during my own NDE, a sense of being fully present beyond the constraints of time. Master Nakamura, a senior monk in his 70s, joined us for tea after the meditation period. When Dr. Tanaka explained my experience and our research, the elderly monk nodded thoughtfully. "In our tradition," he said through Dr. Tanaka's translation, "we speak of small death and great death. Small death is the physical ending. Great death is the dissolution of the separate self into the greater consciousness, what some call enlightenment." He studied me with kind eyes. "You have experienced great death without completing small death. This is rare." His words resonated deeply. Though framed in different language, his description aligned with what I had experienced, the expansion beyond individual identity into a larger, more encompassing awareness. "Our entire practice," he continued, "is preparation for this transition. We sit in meditation to glimpse what you have seen directly." Over the following days, I returned to the temple whenever our research schedule allowed. Master Nakamura taught me a simple meditation practice focused on breath awareness, a technique for accessing expanded consciousness while still embodied. I found it brought me briefly into states reminiscent of my NDE, though less intense, moments of profound peace, clarity, and connection. This unexpected spiritual dimension complemented the scientific work I was engaged in. I began to see that these were not opposing approaches, but complementary paths toward understanding the same profound mystery, the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical existence. Upon returning home, I incorporated meditation into my daily routine. The practice helped me process the emotional intensity of working with dying patients and their families. It also allowed me to maintain a connection to the expanded awareness I had experienced during my NDE, even as I went about ordinary activities. 6 years after my cardiac arrest, Mia graduated from college with a degree in neuroscience and a minor in comparative religion, subject choices directly influenced by my experience and subsequent work. At her graduation dinner, she announced her plan to apply to medical school. "I want to work in palliative care," she told me, "but with a research focus on consciousness at the end of life." "Following in your mother's unconventional footsteps?" I asked, touched by her choice. "Building on them," she corrected with a smile. "There's still so much we don't understand. I want to help bridge the gap between science and spirituality in medicine." Her words filled me with profound gratitude. My NDE had not only transformed my own life, but had shaped my daughter's path as well. The ripples continued to spread outward in ways I could never have anticipated when my heart stopped beating in room 412. Today, nearly 7 years since that pivotal moment, I continue my work at St. Vincent Memorial, though in a modified role that allows time for research, writing, and speaking engagements. The Compassionate Transitions program has been implemented in hospitals across the country. The Healthcare NDE Registry has grown to include over 500 verified accounts from medical professionals worldwide. I still encounter skepticism, of course. Some colleagues maintain that NDEs are merely hallucinations produced by a dying brain, the final fireworks of neural activity before darkness. I no longer feel compelled to convince them otherwise. The evidence we've gathered speaks for itself, and some questions may remain at the boundary of scientific inquiry, at least for now. What matters most to me is the comfort this work brings to those facing death and to the loved ones they leave behind. I've sat with hundreds of dying patients, holding space for their transition with the knowledge that they are not ending but transforming. I've counseled countless grieving families, offering the perspective that death is not the severing of connection, but a change in its form. Last month, I received a letter from Robert Keller's wife. Robert had passed away peacefully in his Arizona home 5 years after his near-fatal heart attack in room 412. In his final moments, she wrote, he had spoken of seeing a brilliant light and had mentioned my name. He said to tell you he understood now, her letter concluded, that everything you told him was true, that he was not afraid, and that his father was waiting for him. These moments of confirmation arrive regularly in my work, small glimmers of evidence that what I experienced was real, that the message I brought back matters. They sustain me through the challenges of bridging worlds that our society has long kept separate: medicine and spirituality, science and subjective experience, life and what lies beyond it. As I write these final reflections, I'm sitting by my living room window, watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in colors that remind me of what I witnessed on the other side. Mia will arrive soon for our weekly dinner, a tradition we've maintained despite her busy medical school schedule. Later, I'll review data from our latest research protocol and prepare for tomorrow's presentation at the hospital's grand rounds. My life is full, rich with purpose, connection, and meaning. The fear that once shadowed my days, fear of dying, of losing those I love, of not accomplishing enough, has been replaced by a deep trust in the continuity of consciousness and the permanence of love. This doesn't mean I never experienced doubt or grief. I remain fully human, with all the emotions and limitations that entails, but underneath these temporal experiences flows a current of certainty about what truly matters and what endures. Death is not the end of our story. It's merely a transition to another chapter, one that I've been privileged to glimpse ahead of time. When my moment comes again, as it eventually will, I'll approach it not as a stranger, but as someone returning to a place they've visited before and found beautiful beyond description. Until then, I remain here, living fully in this world, while maintaining awareness of the greater reality that awaits us all. My heart stopped in room 412, but my consciousness continued. And in that continuation, I found not just personal transformation, but a mission to illuminate the threshold between worlds and to ease the passage for others who will inevitably cross it. We are more than our physical bodies. We are consciousness itself, temporarily housed in flesh, but ultimately unbounded. This knowledge doesn't diminish the importance of our embodied lives, but rather infuses them with deeper meaning and purpose. Every act of kindness, every moment of presence, every expression of love ripples outward in ways we cannot fully comprehend from this side of existence. That's the message I carried back from beyond the flatline. That's the truth I live by each day. And that's the assurance I offer to you, whoever you are, reading these words, and perhaps wondering about your own inevitable journey across the threshold. You are not alone. You have never been alone. And when your time comes, you will be welcomed home with a love beyond anything this world can offer. Until then, live fully, love deeply, pay attention to the sacred that hides within the ordinary, and know that death is not the end, merely a doorway to what comes next.